There were 43 of us seated in the assessment chamber aboard orbital platform Nessic, arranged in 6 rows of curved individual alcoves, each one sealed from the others by a low hum of acoustic baffling. The chamber was built into the platform's outer ring, which meant the walls curved slightly inward above us, giving the whole space the feeling of sitting inside a throat. The lighting was clean and white. The air already tasted faintly of metal. Chief Proctor Sarvanol stood at the front, hands folded behind his back, 8 fingers overlapping in some configuration I couldn't parse. The Orith were bone pale, their skin carrying a faint electromagnetic shimmer that served, I'd been told in orientation, as a passive stress reader. They could feel elevated neural output the way you'd feel a warm hand through glass. Sarvanol had designed this particular exam himself, which he mentioned in the same tone a man might use to say he designed a door, factual, unremarkable, utterly without warmth. This is the cognitive persistence assessment, he said. 4 hours. 1 stylus. 70 cognitive load problems escalating across 3 suppression tiers. The atmospheric composition of this chamber will shift incrementally, reducing available oxygen and introducing a calibrated sensory compression field that simulates high-stress operational environments. You will feel it as mild disorientation, then as pressure behind the eyes, then as a general slowing of processing speed. This is by design. He paused and looked along the rows the way you'd look at furniture you'd arranged. No candidate in 11 years of this program has submitted before the 4-hour window closes. Several have not submitted at all. Nobody said anything. You may begin. The stylus in my hand was a standard issue assessment tool, thin, warm, light-sensitive tip that registered on the desk surface as a visual trace. I looked at problem 1. I started writing. Here is what nobody in that room knew about me except the clerical officer who'd misfiled my candidacy application 9 months earlier. I had spent the previous 4 years running deep ice drilling operations on Europa Station. Not supervising them. Running them. Which meant 12-hour shifts in a pressurized borehole habitat where the ambient oxygen was kept at 63% of surface standard to reduce the risk of equipment fire, where the sensory compression from the ice mass above us was a constant low-grade pressure that the long-timers called the squeeze, and where time behaved strangely, stretched in some patches, compressed in others, because the combination of low O2 and sustained acoustic pressure did something to the human brains. Internal clock that the neuroscientists hadn't fully documented yet, but that every driller on station knew firsthand. You learned to think inside it. Or you requested a surface transfer in your first 30 days, and some people did, and that was fine. But the ones who stayed learned to think inside it the way you learn to ride a bike, not by understanding the physics, but by doing it until your body stopped fighting and started cooperating. Sarvanuel's suppression field, Tier 1, was 81% of surface standard oxygen with a 15 Hz sensory compression overlay. I drilled at 63. I kept writing. At the 20-minute mark I heard the first sound from the row to my left, a slow exhale, the kind that means a body is trying to manage something it doesn't like. At 24 minutes there was a quiet thud, which I later learned was candidate Eriksdal, a Vethian with 4 independent neural processing clusters, resting his broad flat head on the desk surface because the compression field had knocked 2 of his clusters offline and he was attempting to reroute through the remaining pair. At 30 minutes, Tier 2 activated. I felt it as a slight increase in the pressure behind my sternum, the same sensation I associated with the midshift drop at Europa when the borehole habitat descended past the 40-meter mark. My handwriting didn't change. I was on problem 38. The problems in the middle tier were not simple. They were designed to require the candidate to hold 3 independent datasets in working memory, extract a relational pattern across all 3, and produce a command decision in 8 lines or fewer. Under standard atmospheric conditions, with a rested human brain, I'd estimate maybe 60% of test takers complete them cleanly. Under Tier 2 suppression, the Orith Candidacy Committee apparently expected about 20% completion, enough to separate candidates who had trained for stress from those who merely read about it. The trick, which is not a trick but a physiological fact, is that low oxygen cognitive load doesn't reduce all processing equally. The parts of the brain that handle sequential, step-by-step reasoning degrade first. The parts that handle pattern recognition and parallel association, the parts that fire when you're looking at a piece of drilling equipment that's behaving wrong and you need to know which of 4 possible failures it is before the shift lead gets hurt, those parts hold longer. You become, briefly and usefully, better at seeing across data than through it. I finished problem 47. Problem 48. My stylus moved. I wasn't aware of the chamber anymore, not really. I was aware of the desk surface and the problems and the faint familiar weight of thin air, which felt like coming home to a house I hadn't visited in 9 months but still knew by feel in the dark. At the 40-minute mark, the candidate in the alcove to my right made a sound I'd heard before, on station, when a junior driller finally lost the argument with Tier 2 suppression, a short, involuntary exhale, like the body deciding to stop pretending it was fine. I didn't look up. There was nothing useful in looking up. Tier 3 activated at minute 46. I know the timestamp because I noted it in the margin of problem 61, a habit from drilling logs where you marked any environmental shift with the time so that after-action analysis had a clean data set. Tier 3 was the one that broke records. Savinol had said as much, indirectly, with the phrase several have not submitted at all. Tier 3 added a neurological feedback component. The compression field shifted from passive to active, which meant it wasn't just reducing sensory clarity but introducing a low-level interference pattern in the brain's own electromagnetic output. The Orath called this a cognitive ceiling. The body's processing capacity didn't just slow down, it hit a wall. I felt it as a sound, which is the wrong word but the only one I have. A low, sourceless hum just inside the range of perception. At Europa, the equivalent experience was what happened when the bore drill's vibration harmonized with the ice formation at depth. The habitat itself would begin to resonate, and every person inside it would feel a frequency in their back teeth and the base of their skull for about 90 seconds until the drill operator adjusted the bit angle. You learned, on station, not to stop thinking when that happened. You learned to think through the sound. You learned that the sound was information, that the harmonic meant the ice had changed, and you converted the discomfort into data because the alternative was to stand frozen in the middle of a pressurized habitat while things happened around you that required your attention. I wrote through it. Problem 62, 63, 64. At minute 50, I became aware that the room was very quiet in a way that meant most of the 43 of us had stopped moving. I didn't count. I kept writing. Problem 66 required a command decision under partial information. 6 data points, 2 of which were contradictory, 1 of which was almost certainly noise, and the task was to identify which one was noise and issue the command that followed from the remaining 5. At Europa, we called this reading the drop, the moment in a drill sequence where the sensor array was giving you more inputs than you could cleanly reconcile and you had to decide, fast, which ones to trust. I issued the command. 8 lines. I moved to 67. At minute 53, I finished problem 70. I set the stylus down on the desk surface. I looked at the problem set. All 70 responses were there, marked in the light-sensitive trace on the desk, clean and complete. I did a pass from the beginning, not anxious, just checking the way you check a drill log before you sign it, and I found one arithmetic error in problem 22 that I corrected in 4 seconds. Then I pressed the submission contact on the desk's upper right corner. The chamber's system registered the action. A soft chime, 1 tone. The kind of tone designed to be unobtrusive, to avoid disrupting the candidates still working. In the front of the room, Sava Newell's head turned. The Orath don't have a word for surprise that I know of. But their skin sense, the electromagnetic shimmer, responds to unexpected inputs the same way human skin responds to cold. A slight tightening, a visible change in the surface quality. I saw it from 50 feet away, even through the mild Tier 3 haze. The shimmer across Sava Newell's neck and forearms went briefly, distinctly brighter. He looked at the submission timestamp. He looked at me. He looked at the timestamp again. 7 minutes remained on the Tier 1 clock. The first clock. The one that marked the end of the first hour, before the exam's own 4-hour window had cleared its first quarter. The room was so quiet I could hear the suppression field sub-bass hum, which I'd stopped registering as noise about 40 minutes earlier. Savinol walked the length of the chamber. He stopped at the edge of my alcove. He looked at the completed problem set on my desk. He looked at me with the flat attention of a man whose electromagnetic skin sense was telling him something his experience couldn't fully process, a brain that wasn't under stress, inside an environment designed to produce maximum stress, in a time window that should have been the least productive 90 minutes of the 4-hour exam. You submitted, he said. Yes. All 70 problems. Yes. He stood there for a moment. The shimmer hadn't settled. Europa Station, I said, because it seemed like it might save him some processing time. Deep ice drilling. 4 years. Tier 3 is about 63% of what we ran at midshift. The neurological feedback component is new to me, but the harmonics in the same frequency range as bore drill resonance, so. I looked at the desk. It mostly felt familiar. He looked at the problem set for another 5 seconds. Then he turned and walked back to the front of the room. I sat in my alcove for the remaining 3 hours and 47 minutes of the exam window, because the protocol required it. I couldn't leave. I spent the time listening to the suppression field cycle through its tiers and thinking about the difference between an environment designed to be survived and an environment so well practiced it became quiet. The room recalibrated around me in slow increments as each candidate either submitted or stopped responding. Sarvanal stood at the front. Occasionally he glanced at my alcove, and occasionally the shimmer across his forearms did the thing it had done when I submitted. The lights came up at the 4-hour mark. 11 of the 43 had submitted completed problem sets. 6 had partial submissions. The rest had the blank expressions of people who'd hit the ceiling and hadn't come down yet. Sarvanal called my name first when the results were logged, which was not standard protocol. He said my name and then said nothing else for a moment, which I understood to mean he was choosing words. Then he said, "You will report to advanced candidacy orientation at 0600 tomorrow." That was all. On the transit back to the residential ring, I thought about the squeeze, that constant low weight the ice puts on you, for weeks and months and then years, until you stop noticing it's there. There's a version of hardship that wears you down, and there's a version that just becomes the water you swim in. Europa had given me the second kind. Sarvanal had built a very good exam. It simply hadn't been designed for a man who learned to think at the bottom of a moon.